The fourth contraction hit as the blizzard swallowed the last visible trace of the trail, and she knew then that both she and her unborn child would die in this Wyoming wilderness unless she found shelter within the hour. They had left her here deliberately once her condition became impossible to hide. Clementine Winters, former Boston schoolteacher, now abandoned in the January 1876 frontier, with nothing but the clothes on her back and Nathaniel Harrow's unacknowledged child beneath her heart. The stagecoach driver had called it bad luck. The other passengers called it divine justice. She called it murder. Another contraction doubled her over. Through tears freezing on her cheeks, she glimpsed a distant smudge of smoke rising against the white sky. Shelter, perhaps, or hostile strangers. Either seemed preferable to freezing alone among the pines, her child never drawing breath. With renewed purpose, Clementine staggered toward the smoke, one hand protecting her belly. Jonas Gray Bear sensed the storm's approach before the first snowflake fell. 5 winters alone in this mountain cabin had attuned him to nature's warnings. The sudden silence of birds, the shifting wind carrying the scent of snow. By the time the blizzard unleashed its fury, he had already stacked extra firewood, checked his food stores, and settled in for the isolation that was both his protection and his punishment. He had just added another log to the stone fireplace when Shadow, his gray mountain horse, whinnied from the lean-to shelter. Jonas cocked his head, listening beyond the wind's howl. Most animals would have sought shelter hours ago. Something, or someone, was moving through his territory. "Fool travelers," he muttered, reluctantly pulling on his bearskin coat. No one with sense crossed these mountains in winter, especially with a storm brewing. But if someone was desperate enough to be out in this weather, they were desperate enough to die in it. Shadow stamped nervously as Jonas approached. Following the horse's gaze, he peered through the thickening snow. At first, he saw nothing but white, then a darker shape moving with painful slowness. A person, clearly struggling. Years of solitude had hardened Jonas against the complications of other people's troubles. Yet he found himself trudging through deepening snow, following the stumbling figure who had now collapsed into a drift. As he drew closer, he realized it was a woman, and she was heavy with child. "God's teeth," he swore, kneeling beside her. Her face was dangerously pale, lips tinged blue, but her eyes fluttered open at his touch. They were deep brown, filled with both fear and a stubborn will to survive that he recognized all too well. "The baby," she whispered through chattering teeth. "It's coming." Jonas carried the woman to his cabin with efficient, economical movements. Inside, he laid her near the fire on his sleeping pallet, then swiftly gathered what supplies he had. Clean rags, boiled water, the herbs his grandmother had taught him would ease birthing pains. His hands moved with practiced confidence that belied his racing thoughts. "What's your name?" he asked, helping her out of her snow-crusted coat. "Clementine," she gasped, another contraction seizing her. "Clementine Winters." "Fitting," Jonas said, his voice deliberately calm. "I'm Jonas Gray Bear. This is my land you're birthing on." Her eyes widened slightly at his name, taking in his features. The high cheekbones, copper skin, and long black hair, tied back with a leather cord. But another wave of pain erased whatever prejudices might have surfaced. "The child is coming fast," Jonas said, checking her condition with clinical detachment, not waiting for better circumstances. If I don't survive this," Clementine began, her voice cracking, "the child will live." "So will you." Jonas met her gaze firmly. "I have delivered foals, calves, and yes, children before." "Why would you help me?" she asked, suspicion briefly overcoming pain. Even wolves don't leave their own to die in snow. Hours blurred together in a haze of pain and effort. Outside, the blizzard reached its howling crescendo as Clementine's labor intensified. Jonas worked steadily, speaking occasional words of encouragement in both English and his native tongue. When the child finally slid into the world with a lusty cry, the storm abruptly calmed, as though nature itself had been holding its breath. A boy, red-faced and strong-lunged. Jonas performed a simple blessing with water, then placed the swaddled infant in Clementine's trembling arms. By the customs of my people, a child born on this land during winter's heart belongs to the mountain. There are men looking for you, he added, peering through frost-rimed windows. And they don't seem the type to bring gifts for the baby. A week passed in the quiet routine of survival. Clementine's strength returned slowly, each day bringing more color to her cheeks as she learned the rhythms of cabin life. Jonas watched her adaptation with guarded approval, noting how quickly she mastered the small tasks he assigned, banking the fire to last through night, preparing simple meals from his stores, caring for her son with growing confidence. The boy, whom she had named Isaac, thrived despite his dramatic arrival. Jonas found himself studying the child's features when Clementine wasn't looking, searching for traces of whoever had abandoned his mother to die in the snow. I taught literature and mathematics to young ladies in Boston, Clementine said one morning as she watched Jonas skin a rabbit he'd snared. Now I can't even feed my own child without help. Different knowledge for different worlds, Jonas replied, his knife moving with practiced precision. Here, knowing how to read weather means more than books. Will you teach me? She asked, surprising him. I learn quickly. Jonas paused, studying her face for mockery and finding none. We start with fire, then food. Books come later. Later that day, he showed her how to hold the bow he used for hunting, a skill she would need if she planned to survive beyond these mountains. As he positioned her arms and demonstrated the proper stance, he noticed her glancing repeatedly toward the snow-covered ridge to the east. You're afraid they'll find you, he said. Clementine lowered the bow. Yes. Who are they? Her eyes dropped to Isaac, sleeping peacefully in his makeshift cradle. Men who would take him from me. Men who would prefer we both had died in that storm. 3 days later, the warning came with the distant crunch of snow beneath horses' hooves. Jonas heard it first, his head lifting sharply from the firewood he was splitting. He motioned Clementine inside with a quick gesture she had learned to obey without question. Riders, he said simply. 3, moving slow, searching, not traveling. Clementine gathered Isaac and retreated into the cabin's shadowed interior, her heart hammering against her ribs. Jonas positioned himself casually by the woodpile, axe still in hand, but held as if he'd merely paused in his work. The riders appeared through the trees, 3 men in heavy coats, rifles across their saddles. City men, Jonas noted, unused to mountain travel, but determined enough to brave the harsh conditions. Their eyes scanned the clearing, taking in the cabin, the lean-to shelter, and finally, Jonas himself. You there, called the lead rider, a thick-necked man with a marshal's badge that didn't quite match his predatory eyes. Been tracking through this God-forsaken country for days. Seen a woman, dark red hair, heavy with child. Ran from Denver 3 weeks back. Jonas leaned on his axe handle. Only woman here is my wife. The rider's eyes narrowed. Your wife? Problem with that? Jonas's voice remained neutral, but his posture shifted almost imperceptibly. Just surprising is all, the man said, exchanging glances with his companions. Woman we're looking for is meant for better company than— The cabin door opened, and Clementine appeared with Isaac bundled against her chest. Is there a problem, husband? She called, her voice steady despite the fear Jonas could sense beneath it. Isaac needs his father's help with the fire. Jonas noted the perfect balance in her words. Not too familiar, not too formal. Just right for a frontier wife addressing her husband before strangers. The lead writer studied them both, suspicion warring with the evidence before him. This woman been here long? Long enough, Jonas replied. Winter makes the days blur together. After a tense moment, the riders turned their mounts reluctantly back toward the ridge, but the backward glances told Jonas this wouldn't be their last visit. When the hoofbeats faded into silence, Clementine collapsed onto a bench, trembling hands clutching Isaac to her chest. Jonas secured the door before joining her by the fire. They'll be back, he said simply. Yes. Clementine's voice was hollow. He doesn't give up easily. Jonas waited, watching her gather courage for what came next. The fire popped and hissed in the silence between them. The man they work for, Nathaniel Harrow, he's Isaac's father, she finally said, eyes fixed on the flames. He promised marriage until he learned I was with child. Then I became an inconvenience. A mining man? Jonas asked, his expression unreadable. Clementine looked up, surprised. Yes? How did you know? The type who searches these mountains usually hunts silver or gold, not women. He poked at the fire, sending sparks dancing up the chimney. Unless the woman carries something valuable. Only his shame, she whispered. A respected businessman can't have complications. Jonas was silent for a long moment, studying the child's sleeping face. Then he rose and retrieved a rolled hide map from a shelf, spreading it before her on the rough-hewn table. Your son was born here, he said, pointing to a valley marked with symbols she couldn't read. By both tribal law and the Henderson Treaty of 1868, Isaac has a claim to this valley. Clementine stared at him, uncomprehending. What does that mean? It means, Jonas said, his finger tracing a mineral vein marked on the map, that your son now holds legal claim to the very land Harrow wants to mine. Understanding dawned in Clementine's eyes as she looked from the map to her sleeping child. For the first time since her arrival, she smiled. 3 days to the tribal council if weather holds, Jonas said, studying the sky for signs of another storm. We travel light, move fast. Clementine stood in the cabin doorway, Isaac secured against her chest in a carrier Jonas had fashioned from soft deer hide. The strange contraption kept the baby warm against her body while leaving her hands free, one of many tribal innovations that had impressed her during their weeks together. Is it safe to take Isaac in this cold? She asked, her breath forming white clouds in the morning air. Safer than waiting for Harrow's men to return with reinforcements, Jonas replied, checking the travois attached to Shadow. Children of my people travel this way from birth. Clementine nodded, trusting his judgment. In the 3 weeks since her arrival, Jonas had proven himself not just a reluctant rescuer, but a surprisingly patient teacher. Under his guidance, she had begun to shed her Eastern helplessness like an outgrown skin. The documentation from the tribal council. What will it prove exactly? She asked, securing her borrowed coat more tightly. That Isaac was born on treaty land under tribal witness, Jonas explained. The Henderson Treaty gives children born on tribal land certain rights that even territorial courts must recognize. He paused, adding leather straps to her boots for better traction in snow. With the right papers, even Harrow can't simply take what belongs to your son. Clementine touched the rough logs of the cabin that had sheltered her when she had nothing. Leaving its protection felt like stepping from a harbor into open sea, yet she knew they couldn't remain. Harrow's men would return, in greater numbers and with less patience. "I'm ready," she said, squaring her shoulders as Jonas checked Isaac's wrappings one final time. Together, they stepped away from the cabin and into the wilderness, the snow-covered mountains rising before them like the pages of an unwritten story. By midday, Clementine understood why Jonas had insisted they begin at first light. The mountain terrain demanded constant vigilance, narrow trails skirting steep drops, treacherous ice hidden beneath innocent-looking snow, fallen trees creating obstacles that required careful navigation. What had seemed a straightforward journey on his map revealed itself as a gauntlet of small perils requiring endless adaptation. "Step exactly where I step," Jonas instructed as they approached a frozen stream crossed by a fallen pine. "The ice won't hold your weight." Clementine followed his path, one careful foot after another, Isaac sleeping peacefully against her chest. The log bridge, stripped of bark and slick with frost, stretched like a promise over the dark water below. Her heart hammered as she balanced, remembering Boston sidewalks and how she had once complained about muddy hems. When she reached the other side, she found Jonas watching her with something approaching approval. "I believe that's the first time I've seen you almost smile, Mr. Graybear," she said, surprising herself with the lightness in her voice. "Jonas," he corrected, "and you did well. Most Eastern women would have demanded to be carried. I stopped being most Eastern women the day they left me in a snowstorm." They made camp that evening in a sheltered hollow. Jonas built a fire with efficiency that still amazed her, coaxing flames from seemingly nothing. Under his guidance, Clementine arranged pine boughs to create a windbreak while he prepared a simple stew from dried meat and roots. As darkness settled around them, the stars emerged with startling clarity. Clementine found herself telling Jonas about her life before, teaching at Miss Porter's school for young ladies, her dreams of someday opening her own academy. He listened quietly, occasionally feeding the fire, his face unreadable in the flickering light. "You had a different life too, didn't you?" she finally asked. "Before the cabin." Jonas was silent for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "Yes, I was a treaty interpreter. I spoke for my people to men who didn't want to hear." The tribal winter encampment appeared first as smoke rising from lodges nestled against a protected hillside. Jonas straightened as they approached, an almost imperceptible change that nevertheless communicated volumes to Clementine. This was his history, his people, the world he had left behind. "Your tribe?" she asked quietly. "Once," he replied. "I haven't returned since Black Rock." Before she could ask what he meant, a woman emerged from between the lodges, her dark eyes widening at the sight of them. She was perhaps Jonas's age, with striking features and an air of authority in the way she approached. "5 winters with no word, cousin, and now you bring a white woman and claim her child?" The woman's voice held equal measures of disbelief and suspicion. "Sarah," Jonas acknowledged with a nod. "The boy was born on treaty land. He has rights that need protection." Sarah's gaze shifted to Clementine and Isaac, assessing them with unnerving directness. "And what of your rights? Your people? You disappeared after Black Rock." "I'm here now, aren't I?" Their silent standoff broke when an elderly man emerged from the largest lodge, his weathered face breaking into a smile at the sight of Jonas. Words flowed between them in a language Clementine couldn't understand, though she recognized the affection in the old man's tone. After a brief conversation, Jonas turned to Clementine. "This is Elder White Elk, keeper of the council records. He will hear our case." Inside the council lodge, Clementine sat with Isaac in her arms, acutely aware of the many eyes upon them. Jonas spoke at length in his native tongue, occasionally gesturing to her and the child. Though she understood nothing of the words, she recognized the cadence of formal address, the careful construction of a legal argument. When he finished, the elders conferred among themselves while Sarah watched Clementine with unwavering attention. "They will help," Jonas finally translated. "But there is more at stake than just your son's claim." The record-keeper's lodge smelled of smoke, leather, and history. Elder White Elk moved with reverence as he pulled an ancient parfleche case from beneath a sleeping platform, carefully untying the thongs that sealed it. "These are the sacred records," Jonas explained softly to Clementine. "Treaties, births, deaths, the true history of our people." White Elk spread several documents on a woven mat before them. Some were tribal records on tanned hide, others were official government papers with faded seals and signatures. Jonas and Sarah conferred over them, occasionally translating sections for Clementine. The Henderson Treaty established protection for mineral rights on births occurring within the boundary stones, Jonas explained, pointing to a map with markings. "Your son was born here, within the sacred circle." Clementine studied the documents, her teacher's eye noting discrepancies between the English and tribal versions. "These don't say the same things," she observed. Sarah gave her a sharp look. "You can tell that?" "The English version mentions reasonable access to mineral deposits. The tribal markings show absolute boundaries with no access provisions." Clementine traced the different sections with her finger. "I taught document analysis to advanced students." Jonas translated her observation to White Elk, whose eyes narrowed thoughtfully. "There is more," the elder said through Jonas. He produced another set of papers, land transfer records, with signatures that immediately caught Clementine's attention. "These papers show 6 treaties broken," Jonas translated as White Elk spoke. "Here, Harrow Mining Company claimed flood damage destroyed Blackfoot lands, but these survey maps show they diverted the river themselves." "The signatures don't match," Clementine said, examining the papers closely. "This was forged by the same hand that signed these other documents." "The Black Rock disaster," Jonas said quietly. 40 people died when that dam broke. My father among them. Suddenly, Harrow's pursuit made terrible sense. This wasn't just about Isaac or her. It was about concealing a history of fraud and death that could destroy his empire. "He'll kill to keep this buried," Sarah said, meeting Clementine's eyes with new respect. "You understand what these documents mean?" Thomas Wells asked, his weathered face serious beneath his battered hat. The former Pinkerton detective had arrived at the tribal camp the previous evening, summoned by Sarah Two Rivers through channels Clementine didn't fully understand. "They prove Harrow's company falsified records and caused the Black Rock disaster," Clementine replied, checking Isaac's wrappings before their departure. "They also establish Isaac's legal claim to the valley through the Henderson Treaty." Thomas nodded, carefully securing duplicate documents inside his oilskin pouch. "Judge Abernathy in Sweetwater is no friend of Harrow's. With these papers, he can issue an injunction stopping any mining activity on treaty lands." "Which is why we're dividing the evidence," Jonas added, adjusting Shadow's saddle. "Harrow's men will be watching the main trails." The plan was simple but effective. Thomas would take the eastern route to Sweetwater with one set of documents, while Jonas, Clementine, and Isaac would return via the western trail with another. If either party failed to reach the judge, the other might succeed. "I'll travel south first to avoid Harrow's men," Thomas said, mounting his horse. "We'll meet at Black Rock Creek in 1 week if all goes well." "And if it doesn't?" Clementine asked, the weight of their undertaking suddenly heavy upon her. "Then these documents will still reach the territorial governor," Thomas assured her, patting his coat where the papers were hidden. As they watched him ride away, Jonas's hand briefly touched Clementine's shoulder, a gesture of reassurance that had become increasingly common between them. "We should move," he said, his eyes scanning the ridgeline. "Someone's watching the camp." They had been traveling for most of the day when Jonas raised his hand for a halt, his body suddenly tense as a drawn bowstring. The narrow canyon they were traversing had seemed a safer route than the exposed ridge trail, but now Clementine saw the danger: high walls on either side, limited visibility ahead, and only one direction for retreat. "What is it?" she whispered, instinctively drawing Isaac closer. "Tracks," Jonas replied, kneeling to study marks in the snow that Clementine's untrained eye had missed entirely. 5 men, waiting ahead. Before she could respond, a rifle shot cracked through the canyon, the bullet splintering bark from a tree inches from her head. Isaac woke with a startled cry as Clementine dropped to a crouch, her body curling protectively around her son. "Behind the rocks," Jonas commanded, drawing the rifle from his back in a fluid motion. He fired twice toward the canyon bend, forcing their unseen attackers to take cover. "Harrow wants the woman and child," a voice shouted from ahead. "Kill the Indian." Jonas dropped back beside Clementine, quickly reloading. "When I move, take Isaac and run downstream. Don't stop until you reach the fallen pine we passed." "I won't leave you." The very thought seemed impossible after all they had endured together. "You'll protect our son. Go!" Jonas emphasized the word "our" with a fierce intensity that left no room for argument. He burst from cover, firing rapidly as he moved to draw attention away from Clementine. She hesitated only a moment before darting in the opposite direction, keeping low behind the scattered boulders lining the canyon floor. The gunfight behind her intensified, rifle shots echoing off canyon walls, men shouting, then the more personal sounds of struggle. Clementine didn't look back, focusing solely on reaching the fallen pine that marked a small side ravine. Isaac, somehow sensing the danger, remained eerily quiet against her chest. She had just reached the pine when a man stepped from behind it, a cruel smile revealing tobacco-stained teeth. "Mrs. Harrow, I presume," he said, reaching for her arm. Without hesitation, Clementine drove her knee upward with all her strength. As the man doubled over, she grabbed a rock from the streambed and brought it down on his head with a sickening crack. Her hands trembled as she stepped over his crumpled form, shocked at her own capacity for violence. More shots echoed from the canyon, then an ominous silence. Clementine pressed deeper into the ravine, fighting panic as she waited to learn whether Jonas had survived. Blood trailed Jonas like a macabre signature across the snow as he staggered into the ravine. His left shoulder was soaked crimson, his face pale beneath its copper tone, but his eyes remained alert and searching until they found Clementine crouched behind a fallen log. "You're hurt," she said, rushing to support him as he sank against a boulder. "Bullet went through," he managed, breath hitching with pain. "Clean, at least." Clementine helped him remove his coat, then tore strips from her petticoat to create bandages. Her fingers moved with surprising steadiness as she cleaned and bound the wound, knowledge from years of assisting her physician father returning when needed most. "You've done this before," Jonas observed, watching her work. "My father was a doctor. I assisted." She tied off the bandage firmly. "Never thought I'd need those skills in Wyoming." Once the bleeding was controlled, Clementine built a small, nearly smokeless fire using techniques Jonas had taught her. And the irony wasn't lost on her, student now caring for teacher, applying his knowledge to save him. "The documents," she said suddenly, remembering their purpose. "Do you still have them?" Jonas's expression darkened. "They took the satchel. All our copies gone." Clementine felt despair rising like floodwater. All their effort, the dangerous journey, Jonas's wound, all for nothing. Without proof, Harrow would continue unchallenged, and Isaac's claim would remain unenforceable. "We failed," she whispered, watching the tiny flames consume twigs one by one. "Not yet." Jonas reached painfully into his boot, extracting a folded document protected by a small waterproof pouch. "I kept the most important one separate, the birth record with tribal seal." Clementine took the precious paper with trembling hands, hope rekindling. "Will it be enough?" "For an injunction, yes. For justice." Jonas's gaze drifted toward the canyon where the bodies of Harrow's men lay cooling in the snow. "That will take more." "We can't stay here," Jonas said, as twilight deepened the shadows around their small camp. "Harrow will send more men when these don't return." Clementine glanced at Isaac, sleeping peacefully despite the day's violence. How quickly life could shift from quiet cabin routines to desperate flight and bloodshed. How easily she had adapted to both. "How far to Sweetwater?" she asked, already packing their meager supplies. 2 days, good weather." Jonas tested his injured arm, wincing. "Longer in my condition." "I know what you're thinking," Clementine said, meeting his eyes across the fire. "We should separate. You're wounded. Isaac and I will only slow your escape." Jonas studied her face for a long moment. "I knew Harrow would come for these papers, but he doesn't know about the copies, or that Thomas Wells is bringing them to Judge Abernathy right now." "You anticipated this? All of it?" "I've fought men like Harrow before," Jonas replied. "They're predictable in their violence." Clementine spread the map between them, tracing possible routes with her finger. "If you follow the ridge line, you could reach Sweetwater by tomorrow night. I can take Isaac along the creek bed to Martha Fleming's store. You said she's sympathetic?" Jonas nodded. "Her husband lost mining claims to Harrow last year. She'll shelter you." Their hands met over the map, fingers intertwining briefly. "You don't need to face him alone again," Jonas said softly. "I'm not alone anymore," Clementine replied with quiet certainty. "But we need to be smart." As darkness claimed the ravine, they shared one last meal before their paths would temporarily diverge. Neither spoke of the unspoken truth between them, that what had begun as reluctant rescue had grown into something neither had anticipated. Jonas approached Sweetwater with the caution of a wounded wolf entering hostile territory. The frontier town sprawled in the valley below him, its muddy streets and weather-beaten buildings appearing almost peaceful in the late afternoon light. He knew better. Towns like this lived on whispers and silver, both flowing freely through saloons where Harrow's influence would be strongest. He'd avoided the main trail, choosing instead to follow game paths along the ridge, keeping to cover whenever possible. His wounded shoulder throbbed with each step, but the pain kept him alert, focused on the mission rather than the memory of Clementine's face as they'd parted ways. The document rested secure in his boot, wrapped in oilskin and pressed against his ankle. One piece of paper that could change everything, if he could reach Judge Abernathy alive. Jonas waited until dusk before descending into town, using the gathering shadows to mask his approach. He'd almost reached the courthouse when he sensed, rather than saw, movement behind him. The subtle shift of weight, the whisper of leather against wood. "Jonas Gray Bear," came a familiar voice. "You're under arrest for the murder of 3 men found in Blackwater Canyon." Jonas turned slowly to face Sheriff Daniel Cole and his two deputies, their hands resting on holstered revolvers. He'd known Daniel since before Black Rock, when the man had at least pretended to uphold the law evenly. "You know that's a lie, Daniel," Jonas said quietly. Sheriff Cole's eyes flickered, discomfort briefly visible beneath his official mask. "What I know doesn't matter," he said, lowering his voice. "Harrow owns the territorial judge now. Best not resist." Jonas assessed his options. Wounded, outnumbered, in the middle of town. Fighting would only get him killed, and the document lost. "Where is the woman and child?" he asked instead. "Safe. For now." Harrow's offering terms. As the iron cuffs closed around his wrists, Jonas kept his expression neutral, betraying nothing of the backup plans already in motion. The Sweetwater Hotel's finest suite stood in stark contrast to the crude jail cell where Jonas now resided. Polished furniture imported from St. Louis, heavy velvet curtains, and a roaring fire created an atmosphere of civilization and wealth that made Clementine acutely aware of her trail-worn appearance and borrowed clothes. Nathaniel Harrow stood by the window, his back to her as he studied the street below. His tailored suit and perfectly trimmed beard projected the image of Eastern refinement he had used to charm her in Denver. How easily she had once been impressed by such things. How hollow they seemed now. "Clementine," he said finally, turning to face her. "You look remarkably well for someone who's been living with savages." "While you look exactly as expected for someone who abandons women in snowstorms," she replied, her voice steadier than she had anticipated. "A regrettable misunderstanding. My men were instructed to take you to Denver, not leave you." Harrow's practiced smile didn't reach his eyes. Clearly, they exceeded their instructions. "Clearly," she echoed, holding Isaac closer. The baby watched Harrow with solemn eyes, as if already understanding this man was a threat. Harrow approached, reaching to touch the child's face. Clementine stepped back, a protective motion so instinctive she couldn't have prevented it. "He has my eyes," Harrow observed, though perhaps more determined. "What do you want, Nathaniel?" Clementine asked, tired of the pretense. "I'm prepared to be generous," he replied, returning to business. "Return to Denver as my wife. The child will have my name, all advantages. Your Indian friend goes free, and if I refuse," Harrow's smile thinned, "Jonas Graybear will hang for murder, and you'll be committed to an asylum for the delusions that led you to abandon civilization for a savage's bed." He gestured toward papers on his desk, commitment orders already prepared. "Consider carefully, my dear. You have until morning." Jonas's cabin stood empty and cold, the fire long dead in the hearth. Clementine moved through the familiar space, touching objects that had become significant during her time there. The wooden spoon he had carved for her, the bow he had taught her to draw, the bearskin where they had sat during long winter evenings while he told tribal stories to Isaac. Martha Fleming had helped her slip away from town after her meeting with Harrow, providing a horse and directions back to the cabin. "To gather your thoughts," the shopkeeper had said, though both women knew Clementine was gathering much more than that. She fed Isaac while examining the map still spread on the rough-hewn table, tracing the route to Sweetwater with her finger. The courthouse where Jonas was held, the hotel where Harrow waited for her answer, the stagecoach office that could take her east, away from all of it. "What would the school teacher from Boston do?" she asked Isaac, who watched her with eyes that seemed too knowing for his few weeks of life. That woman would have taken Harrow's offer. Safety, security, respectability, the life she had been raised to value above all else. But that woman had died in the snow, and the one Jonas had saved wanted justice, not comfort. In the corner, she found what she had truly come for, a small cache of supplies Jonas had prepared for emergencies, extra ammunition for the rifle he had taught her to shoot, dried meat and hardtack, and most importantly, a leather pouch containing a tribal council seal and blank parchment, tools for creating documents that might be needed. "Your father isn't the man in the fancy hotel," she told Isaac as she changed into clean clothes. "It's the one who declared you his son before you took your first breath." She practiced introductions as Mrs. Graybear while loading the rifle, her voice growing more confident with each repetition. By dawn, when she secured the cabin behind her, the transformation was complete. Clementine Winters, schoolteacher, had fully given way to Clementine Graybear, frontier woman and mother fighting for her family's future. The road to Sweetwater stretched before her, and this time she rode toward danger rather than away from it. Martha Fleming's general store served as the beating heart of Sweetwater, a place where goods, gossip, and grievances flowed in equal measure. When Clementine pushed through the door, conversation stuttered to silence as customers turned to stare at the woman who had become the subject of town speculation. "Mrs. Graybear," Martha called firmly, emphasizing the name as she emerged from behind her counter. "I've set aside those supplies you requested." The deliberate introduction set the tone, and Clementine felt curious eyes assessing her borrowed frontier clothing, the rifle slung across her back, and Isaac secured against her chest in his tribal carrier. She followed Martha to the store's back room, where several people already waited: a silver-haired blacksmith, a young miner with a scarred face, and two women whose calloused hands spoke of hard frontier work. "Folks, this here is Mrs. Graybear," Martha announced. "She has something you all need to hear about tomorrow's land auction." "Graybear?" the blacksmith asked skeptically. "You married that Indian?" "I did," Clementine replied, meeting his gaze directly. "And our son holds legal treaty rights to the land Mr. Harrow plans to sell tomorrow. Land that would benefit this town more as a trading stop than a hole in the ground." She spread the map on Martha's table, pointing to the valley and nearby trails. "Harrow claims mining will bring prosperity, but look at these other towns where he operated." She produced newspaper clippings Martha had collected. "Ghost towns now, abandoned once the silver ran out, with poisoned water and nothing left to sustain families." "The mine means jobs," argued the young miner. "For how long?" Clementine countered. "The silver will run out. Then you'll have a ghost town and poisoned water. Our farm would mean permanent trade." As she continued, laying out the economic benefits of sustainable development versus extractive mining, she saw skepticism slowly giving way to interest. When she finally mentioned the fraudulent nature of Harrow's claims, heads began to nod. "What do you need from us?" the blacksmith finally asked. "Witnesses?" Clementine replied. "Tomorrow at the courthouse, when I present evidence of Harrow's fraud and my son's legal claim." Dusk painted the creek outside town in shades of purple and gold as Clementine waited, wondering if Sarah would come. The meeting point Jonas had designated seemed exposed, vulnerable, but she trusted his judgment even in his absence. The snap of a twig brought her hand instinctively to the rifle, but she relaxed when Sarah Two Rivers emerged from the trees, accompanied by two tribal elders. Their formal appearance, painted faces and ceremonial attire beneath winter furs, conveyed the significance of their presence. The council was divided, Sarah said, after traditional greetings had been exchanged. "Many believe white courts have no honor." "They're often right," Clementine acknowledged. "But Judge Abernathy is different. Thomas Wells confirmed he's reviewing the evidence." "And my cousin?" Sarah's tone softened slightly. "Have you seen Jonas?" "Only from a distance." "They're holding him in the jail." Clementine swallowed hard, remembering Jonas's proud posture even in shackles. He seemed unbroken. "Of course he is. Gray bears bend, but don't break." Sarah's response carried both pride and familiar exasperation. After a brief conversation with the elders in their native tongue, she turned back to Clementine. "Will your townspeople stand against Harrow?" "Some will. Enough, I hope." Clementine shifted Isaac to a more comfortable position. "Will your people come?" 10 warriors in their finest. No weapons, but presence. The treaty requires our witness." Water was shared from a ceremonial flask, sealing the alliance. As they discussed strategy for the courthouse approach and seating arrangements, Clementine noticed how naturally she had come to move between these worlds, the frontier town and tribal customs, just as Jonas had taught her. Before they parted, the elder performed a brief blessing over Isaac, marking his forehead with a symbol Clementine recognized from Jonas's teachings, protection for one who bridges worlds. "Tomorrow," Sarah said simply as they separated, each group taking different paths back toward town to avoid detection. "Tomorrow," Clementine echoed, feeling the weight of the coming confrontation settling on her shoulders. The small room above the saloon offered little comfort but much-needed privacy. Martha had secured it for Clementine's use, ensuring that Harrow wouldn't discover her presence in town before the morning auction. By lamplight, Clementine carefully arranged the documents that would determine their future: Isaac's birth record with the tribal seal, the Henderson Treaty copy, and maps showing the fraudulent boundary adjustments from Black Rock. "You'll need to speak before the bidding starts," Martha advised, watching Clementine prepare. "Once money changes hands, it gets complicated." "I'll be ready." Clementine practiced laying out the papers in precise order. "The tribal representatives will sit front row, making them impossible to ignore. Harrow will try to have them removed. That's why we need the documents presented before he can object. Once Judge Abernathy sees the treaty rights—" Clementine carefully folded the papers into a leather portfolio Jonas had prepared. "You've thought of everything," Martha observed. "Jonas would have," Clementine replied softly. "I'm just trying to be worthy of his trust." After Martha left, Clementine wrote a letter to Jonas, uncertain when or if she would be able to deliver it. She described her plans, her hopes, and finally the feelings that had grown during their shared winter, emotions neither had put into words during their time together. At the window, she could see the jail where Jonas was held, a single lantern burning in the night guard's window. Somewhere across town, in his hotel suite, Harrow would be confidently preparing for tomorrow's auction, certain of his victory. Clementine checked the tribal carrier one final time, ensuring it would keep Isaac secure during the confrontation to come. She laid out her clothing, the finest she had, cleaned and mended for the occasion, and braided her hair in the style Sarah had shown her, incorporating a small feather Jonas had once given her for luck. Dawn would come soon, bringing with it the moment that would determine all their futures. As she settled beside Isaac's makeshift cradle, watching her son's peaceful sleep, Clementine felt surprisingly calm. The storm that had been brewing since Isaac's birth was about to break, and neither Harrow's money nor his guns could stop what was coming. The Sweetwater courthouse had never seen such a diverse assembly. Miners in their rough clothes mingled uneasily with ranchers and shopkeepers. Town matrons with tight-lipped expressions sat near the back, curiosity overcoming propriety. And in the front row, causing the most whispers, 10 tribal representatives in ceremonial attire sat with perfect stillness, their presence transforming the ordinary land auction into something unprecedented. Clementine entered with Martha Fleming beside her, Isaac secured against her chest. She had chosen her appearance carefully, clean frontier dress rather than Eastern fashion, hair braided with the tribal feather visible, and Jonas's documented tribal seal hanging from a leather cord around her neck. Neither fully Eastern nor tribal, but something new, a bridge between worlds, like her son. At the front table, Nathaniel Harrow conferred with his lawyers, his confident smile faltering only slightly when he noticed the tribal representatives. He'd clearly expected her to accept his offer, not mount a public challenge. Sheriff Cole stood near the judge's empty chair, his expression troubled as he caught Clementine's eye. She offered a slight nod, acknowledging their unspoken understanding. He might work for Harrow, but his discomfort suggested limits to his loyalty. "Court clerk says Judge Abernathy reviewed Thomas Wells's documents last night," Martha whispered. "He'll have questions for sure." The courthouse doors opened again, and a murmur rippled through the crowd. Thomas Wells himself entered, accompanied by a distinguished man in Eastern attire who could only be the territorial governor. Harrow's confident expression slipped further. Clementine felt a strange calm settle over her as the court clerk called for order. The past months had transformed her from abandoned victim to frontier survivor, from helpless stranger to community advocate. Whatever happened next, she would face it as the woman Jonas had helped her become. Land auction for parcels 27 through 35, Sweetwater Valley, will commence following title verification, the clerk announced as Judge Abernathy entered the courtroom. "All interested parties, please come forward." Clementine rose, portfolio in hand, and stepped into the aisle just as Harrow approached the bench. Their eyes met across the crowded room, challenge issued and accepted. "Your Honor, before proceedings begin, I must present evidence regarding title legitimacy for the parcels in question," Clementine announced, her teacher's voice carrying clearly through the crowded courthouse. Judge Abernathy, a silver-haired man with shrewd eyes, studied her with interest. "You are?" "Clementine Graybear, Your Honor. My son Isaac Graybear holds treaty rights to this land under the Henderson Treaty of 1868 and tribal law." Harrow stepped forward, smooth and controlled despite the unexpected challenge. "Your Honor, Mrs. Winters, not Graybear, is confused about legal matters. She's been through a terrible ordeal and requires medical attention, not a public forum." "I assure you, I am perfectly sound of mind," Clementine replied, opening her portfolio, "and perfectly clear about the law. The Henderson Treaty, Section 12, states that children born on tribal lands maintain mineral rights regardless of parentage." She approached the bench, presenting Isaac's birth certificate with the tribal seal. "My son was born during the winter storm 6 weeks ago on treaty land with tribal witness. His birth grants him legal protection under territorial law." Judge Abernathy examined the document carefully. "This appears to be in order, though unusual. Mr. Harrow, your response?" "A convenient fabrication," Harrow said dismissively. "The child is mine, born out of wedlock. Any claim of tribal connection is absurd." "You acknowledge paternity, then?" the judge asked sharply. Harrow hesitated, trapped by his own words. "I am prepared to legitimize the child through marriage, yes." Clementine seized the opening. "Then you acknowledge Isaac's claim to your assets, including mining rights. Interesting, given your history with such claims." She presented the second document, the evidence of Harrow's fraudulent boundary adjustments at Black Rock. "These survey maps prove Harrow Mining Company intentionally diverted the river that later flooded and killed 40 people, including Jonas Graybear's father. the same company now seeking rights to land legally protected by treaty. The courthouse erupted in murmurs as Thomas Wells stepped forward with additional documents. Your Honor, the territorial governor has reviewed these findings and recommends immediate injunction against all mining activities on treaty lands. Harrow's composure finally cracked. This is absurd, a conspiracy of savages and their sympathizers. Careful, Mr. Harrow, Judge Abernathy warned. The evidence before me suggests the only conspiracy was yours, to defraud both tribal members and territorial citizens. As Harrow lunged toward Clementine, Sheriff Cole intercepted him, surprisingly quick for his bulk. That's enough, Mr. Harrow. Don't make this worse for yourself. The tribal elders had risen to their feet, dignified yet formidable in their unity. The townspeople Clementine had rallied moved closer in support. And through the courthouse window she glimpsed Jonas being escorted from the jail by the governor's men, his head high despite his shackles. This court finds sufficient evidence to halt the auction pending full investigation, Judge Abernathy declared, bringing down his gavel with finality. Mr. Harrow, you will remain in custody until charges can be formally filed. Spring came early to the valley, melting snow from the meadows and coaxing green shoots from the earth. The cabin that had once been Jonas's solitary refuge now bustled with purpose as Clementine tended the garden they had planted together while Isaac watched from a cradle board propped against a sun-warmed log. 3 months had passed since the courthouse confrontation. Harrow awaited trial in the territorial capital, his mining empire crumbling as investigations uncovered more fraud. The tribal council and town of Sweetwater had formed an unprecedented alliance, with Jonas and Clementine serving as natural bridges between the communities. Sarah says the council approved the trading post plans, Clementine called, as Jonas approached from the newly constructed barn. They'll send 3 families to help establish it by summer. Jonas nodded, a smile touching his lips more frequently these days. And Martha's cousin will bring the first supply wagon next month. The route is already marked. He settled beside her in the garden, automatically checking on Isaac before helping her with the seedlings. Their hands worked in tandem, movements synchronized by months of shared purpose. Sometimes I wonder if I would recognize the woman I was before the snowstorm, Clementine mused, looking across the valley that had almost claimed her life before becoming her home. She's still there, Jonas replied, just stronger now, like a tree that bends with winter but doesn't break. In the distance, riders approached, Sarah with several tribal youth coming for their weekly lessons. Clementine had established a small school that taught both Western education and tribal knowledge, fulfilling her teaching dreams in ways Boston could never have imagined. As Jonas helped her to her feet, his hand lingered on hers, the simple silver band he had placed there a week earlier, catching the spring sunlight. The winter that had nearly claimed Clementine's life had instead given her a family, a home, and a future where different worlds could meet not in conflict but in harmony. Isaac gurgled happily from his cradle board, reaching tiny hands toward the father who had claimed him not through blood but through choice, the strongest bond of all. Well, friend, we've journeyed through a Wyoming winter that tested not just survival skills, but the very meaning of family and belonging. If you're feeling the lingering chill of Clementine's desperate snowstorm, the warmth of Jonas's reluctant rescue, or the fire of justice finally served, I understand completely. Crafting this story has left me changed in ways I'm still discovering, and I suspect Clementine and Jonas's journey might have stirred something in you too. There's something about the frontier that strips away pretense and reveals our true nature. Clementine arrived as a desperate Eastern schoolteacher, abandoned and pregnant, certain her life was ending. Jonas lived in self-imposed exile, believing isolation would protect him from further loss. Yet their unlikely connection formed something neither could have built alone, not just a family, but a bridge between worlds long divided by suspicion and greed. What struck me most while writing their story was how healing comes through unlikely sources. Clementine didn't need rescue as much as she needed purpose. Jonas didn't need solitude as much as he needed someone worth protecting. The child, who could have been a burden, became their greatest strength, his very existence challenging the corruption that had claimed so many lives at Black Rock. Their frontier might seem distant, but their struggles remain familiar. We all face moments when we must decide whether to accept injustice or stand against it, even when standing costs us dearly. We all know the temptation to retreat from pain rather than forge new connections. And most of us understand what it means to build family, not through blood, but through choice and commitment, often with people we least expected to need. In the end, Clementine and Jonas learned what the wilderness teaches those who survive it. Strength isn't measured by independence, but by how we care for one another. Treaties and documents matter, but the most binding agreements are the ones written on our hearts when we choose to protect someone else's future as fiercely as our own. Thank you for traveling this snow-covered trail with me. Stories only truly live when they find readers willing to invest their hearts in flawed characters, striving to become better. Your willingness to follow Clementine, from her desperate snowbound beginning to that sunlit valley of possibility, is what transforms mere words into something that matters.